Thank you. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Stefan. Next to me is my good friend and colleague Henning. We are both software developers, consultants, and trainers.
Yeah, that's right. Goedemiddag.
Thank you.
That's good afternoon for the international guests here.
Okay. So we both work at Workplace Solutions in Hamburg, and our goal today is that we can bring across 3 main points. The first is that we will introduce domain storytelling as an additional tool for your modeling toolbox. Second, domain stories show how people and software systems work together. And if you see a business process as cooperative work, that might change your view on context boundaries. I think that we can all agree that it's crucial for domain-driven design to tap into the knowledge of our domain experts. And for some years now, Henning and I have been using domain storytelling to do that and to talk with our domain experts. That's the knowledge that we want to share with you today. And what better way of sharing is there than by telling a story?
Okay. And I'm the one who's lucky to tell you this story. And Stefan said it. We come from Hamburg, and so the story we will tell you is the story about seafaring. And how does seafaring today look like? Seafaring is typically container shipping. And this container goes on a journey. It is loaded onto this container ship. Can you hear me in the last lines? Yeah, okay, great. On this container ship, this is the CGM Magellan, one of the biggest container ships we currently have. And now my clicker is not working anymore. Okay. I have to be near the laptop. Okay, so the ship is going from Shanghai, which we can see up there, to Hamburg, which we can see down there. So for the Germans in the audience, we do have an Elbphilharmonie. And we do have an airport. Okay, so the ship goes without problem, travels around half the world, through the Indian Ocean, through the Suez Canal, and arrives in the Northern Sea. And there we have the problem. Hamburg, our city, our port, is not situated at the sea, it's not situated at the Northern Sea. You have to sail upstream the river. So Hamburg is situated near the river Elbe. 100 kilometers, you have to go upstream. And that can be a problem for these big ships. Because when you look at the port from above, then you can see, when you compare this river to the open sea, it is not very deep. It is shoal. So, and that's a problem because these big container ships, they are very deep, 18 meters if they're fully loaded. And the other thing is it's pretty crowded because the river is narrow compared to the open sea, and there's a lot of traffic. We have a lot of vessels traveling there. So the question arises, how can that work? How can we bring these ships into the port? And this is only working because there's a special authority, the Hamburg Port Authority, which is working on this. So before the maneuvers are actually brought out, they are simulated. So we are sure the ships that come into the port won't run onto ground. And this is done here in the so-called Nordic Center. The Nordic Center is one of the departments of the Port Authority. And the Nordic Center, you can imagine a bit like the tower at the airport. So the tower manages when can airplanes land and when can they start and where do they go on the apron. And the same thing is true for the Nordic Center. So the Nordic Center talks on the radio to the ships and manages when can which ship come into the port and when does it have to go out. Okay, and I told you they are simulating the maneuvers, and how are they doing this? Yeah, they have these big paper maps we can see here. It's called a so-called depth map, and as you can see, that's a big piece of paper and there's something colorful on it. And when we zoom in, we can see the colorful things that are these small numbers, so-called depth numbers. They show the depth at that particular spot. And so, for example, this is a depth number 11 meters, 0.6. And then there are also these lines. Those are contour lines, or depth lines. So there are, for every full meter, we have one of these lines. And where do these numbers come from? They don't fall from the sky, obviously. So we have a special infrastructure in the port to collect these data, to collect these depths. And there are special ships like this one, the DDDEU, the depth writer. Those are special ships. They are called sounding ships. And these ships sail through the harbor and measure the depth with echo sounding. And they do that every day. And then after that, they send the depth data into the Speicherstadt. There's another department of the Port Authority, the so-called sounding department. And they are working on this data, refining it, calculating the contour lines. And then they draw this depth map. And then they send this depth map onto the other side of the river, where the Nautic Center is located. And in the Nautic Center, the nautical officers or the navigating officers take these big paper depth maps and put it onto their table, and then they simulate the maneuvers with these small pieces of paper or cardboard. And this seems funny, but they are actually doing this, or they were actually doing this. And what's very important, what we can see there is the scale on this silhouette, and of course it's important that this is the same scale as the map underneath it. Okay, so they now take this silhouette and move it over the paper, and that works pretty good because you can see when you touch a value, when you touch a depth that is not deep enough. So you can find your route through the port, and that's what we want to find. Okay, and of course we are technical people. The question that we should ask is there an app for it? Yeah, of course we do that. And I was lucky to be part of the team that developed the solution for this case. With a small team of colleagues from the Workplace Solutions, the company we are working for, and we built this, the Peiltisch, as we say it in German. It's something like sounding table. And as you can see, there's a big touch screen that's lying on a table, so it's a touch table. And when you look at it more closely, you can see that we have this depth map with the numbers, and we also have this silhouette here. For this hand, where the 97 is, that's also a silhouette. And like the silhouette, on the paper version, you can touch it with 2 fingers and navigate it through the harbor and can find your route with it.
Okay. Yeah. So the reason why Henning was able to tell you that story is that a few years ago, domain experts told us the same story. But back then, we didn't use pictures and slides and PowerPoint to record it. We used domain storytelling. And this is how we did it. So imagine you're in the Nautic Center. Okay? I'm a software developer from Workplace Solutions, and I invited a couple of domain experts to learn about how these maneuvers for these large container ships are executed. So please welcome with me here today Henning, the navigating officer. Yeah.
Goedemiddag.
Navigating officers used to be captains at sea. That's why he's allowed to wear this hat. And also here with us is Henning, the cartographer, with his map.
Goedemiddag.
Yeah. Thank you. And behind us is a large whiteboard. And while Henning and Henning tell me their story, I will use these magnetic cards and write on them to visualize the story that they tell me. Okay? So, Henning and Henning, how does maneuver planning for these large container ships work?
Okay, I will start as Henning, the navigating officer. I do the maneuver planning, the maneuver simulation, and I do this because a big ship has arrived in the mouth of the River Elbe. And one of these ships, when the ships arrive in the mouth of the river, they call me and ask me for a route they can take to come into the port.
Okay, who exactly calls you?
Well, it's typically the captain of the ship.
Okay, so we have a captain here, yeah?
Yeah, yeah.
So
yes.
he calls you on the radio?
Yeah, that's right. He calls me on the radio.
Okay, so he calls you on the radio and asks for a route.
That's
Okay.
right. Yeah, and then when I was asked for this route, then I'm going to simulate the maneuver and to find this route. And this I do by taking out my depth map and putting a ship silhouette on it.
Okay, but what's a ship silhouette and what's a depth map and where does this stuff come from?
Okay, a ship silhouette is a small piece of cardboard that I cut out, and the depth map is a large piece of paper with a lot of depth values on it.
Okay, so where do you get the depth map from?
The depth map comes from my colleague Henning, the cartographer.
Okay. So you're the one who creates this depth map.
Yeah, that's right. I'm Henning, the cartographer, and my job is to draw depth maps. That's right. But I cannot do this alone. This is only working because there are ships sailing through the harbor, the sounding ships, and they measure the depth in the port.
Okay, so we have first make some space here on the whiteboard, so there's room for your story. Okay. So you said there's a sounding ship, right?
Yeah, that's
okay.
right.
So, and they measure depth?
That's correct.
Okay, so they measure this depth, and what's happening next?
After they measure the depth, they send it to me, and they send me, to be honest, a lot of data, a lot of depth values, and they some kind of raw, and I have to refine it afterwards. Okay, so for example, they sound every square meter in the port, and I get one value for every square meter.
Okay, so you get a lot of raw depth data.
That's right.
Okay, so what do you do with that data?
Yeah, I refine this data. So, for example, I calculate local minimums. So I don't want to have every square meter one value. I need less values. So I look in areas and see what's the shallowest point in this area. And this is the local minimum. Because if it's deeper, it's no problem, then the ship won't run onto the ground. But if it's shallow, then I have a problem.
Okay.
And I also calculate the contour lines.
Okay, so you calculate the contours, contour lines, and the minimum depths.
Correct.
Then you're done?
Then I'm done calculating, and then I'm doing my real work. Then I draw the depth map.
Okay, so you
I
draw
put
the depth map,
this values, this contours, this minimum depth onto the depth map.
Okay.
And after that, I send this newly created map, this newly drawn map, to my colleague, the navigating officer.
Okay, how do you send it to your colleague?
By mail.
Okay, so you actually print it out and send it by mail?
Yeah,
okay.
That's right.
Good. And then the navigating officer is ready to receive a captain's request for route?
Yeah, that I have to give to my colleague,
okay.
the navigating officer. And yeah, that's right.
Okay.
I now have this depth map and the ship silhouette. And what we probably should tell you is that all of these creation of depth map happens on a daily basis. So every day I get a new depth map from the...
Okay, so make a little note up there.
Okay.
Okay, so then you have the depth map and you have the request for route, and then you put the ship silhouette on the depth map.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Then I put the ship silhouette on the depth map.
But first, you told me you had to create this ship silhouette.
Yeah, that's right. I cut it out of cardboard, so it has the same shape as the ship out in the river. But typically, I don't have to create it newly because probably the ship has already been there to Hamburg, or there are other ships of the same class, of the same ship class have been there.
Okay, so it's safe to assume here that a fitting silhouette is available.
Yeah, that's the typical case.
Okay,
that's right.
So, what's happening next?
So now I take the ship silhouette and move it on the depth map, and I move it and I turn it around because I want to find a route.
Okay. So move and turn the ship silhouette to find the route, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. And then I call the captain on the radio and discuss this route with him.
Okay, so actually talk him through the maneuver. Okay.
Yes, that's right. I talk him through so he can then do the exact right maneuver to come safely into the harbor.
Okay. And that's maneuver planning? Did we miss something?
That is maneuver planning.
Okay, on a big picture. Good, thank you. So this, of course, is a little bit of a simplification, but it's sufficient for us to explain what domain storytelling is about. So what you've seen is that domain storytelling is not just story as text. We use pictograms, symbols, to tell our story. So we have a set of different symbols that are basic vocabulary. So we have actors, we have work objects, and arrows are our activities, and then we use textual annotations. And to add concrete meaning to the symbols, we add text to them to express what they represent. When we look at the symbols a little bit closer, or the different types of symbols, we will see that there are actually different kinds of actors. So typical variations are we have a person, or a group, or an IT system. In our example, the ship was an actor. So it's very typical to customize the set of symbols you use so it fits to your domain. And also there are different symbols available, or we use different symbols for the work objects. So in our example, a route is maybe something that is represented via a call by radio, or it could be something that is written down on a piece of paper. Still, it's the same route, it's the same thing, it's the same concept. But depending on where we are in our story, it's represented in a different way. And that's what we want to express with the symbols. So they're not just there because they look nice, they're there because they convey some meaning. So we can actually see information change its shape, its representation, its medium. What we do then is, with these few basic symbols, we form sentences. And the goal is to form sentences that read almost like natural language. And to tell a story, we need, of course, several sentences. So what we do now is we append sentences, and to show in which order the sentences should be read, we add numbers to our sentences. And what's typical for domain storytelling is that we don't use any symbols for ifs or gateways or decisions. A story is always one specific case, one concrete example. And to sum up this idea, so our motto is kind of, we would rather have 3 good examples than a premature or a vague abstraction. Okay? So what we saw now was big picture domain storytelling. There's a lot more to talk about domain storytelling. You can use it for different parts of domain-driven design. There are different ways that we use it to talk about requirements or even to do tactical design. And if you want to learn more about that and practice domain storytelling with us, you can come to our hands-on session tomorrow at 11 Or, of course, if you see us at a conference, just grab us and we will do a Modeling with Strangers session together with you.
Okay. And as Stefan said, we have done a big picture domain story. And when we look at the big picture, we look typically at the whole domain or large parts of the domain. And what we are doing with the domain is we model it. And of course, as we're told by strategic design, we don't want the whole domain, especially such a big domain as this, we don't want this to be modeled into one large and cluttered model, but instead we want to have several smaller and better understandable models. And when we build several models, we introduce boundaries. So we have boundaries between these models, and yeah, then we have bounded context because the models exist in context. We all know that. But we don't want to have boundaries that are like this. We don't want to build the Berlin Wall. We want to build boundaries that separate models, but do not separate people. So we want that people are still able to work together. We want different models so we can build a software that's easy to understand and that is less error prone, but it should also be a software system that can be easily used by different kinds of users. So let's look at this story we have told. And let's see if we can find some indicators where bounded contexts might be. When we look at the layout of this domain story, we can see there are at least two kinds of work items. Work items that belong to one actor alone. One actor is alone working on such an item, and other items are used to work together. So this depth map, for example, is given from the cartographer to the navigating officer. And often this can be an indicator for candidates that are bounded context. Let's look at these candidates. We have a cartography candidate down here on the left, where we have the cartographer and the creation of the depth map, the calculating of the contours and the contour lines and the minimum values. And up there we have the candidate maneuver planning. There we also have a depth map, but we have a different model of the depth map, because here we don't calculate contour lines. Here we use a ship silhouette on it. We want to do a maneuver simulation. So what we suggest is there's a boundary here through this depth map. So the depth map is given over this boundary.
Okay, so our first indicator is a one-way information flow. You saw that there's this one information, one piece of paper, one document, the depth map that is exchanged in one direction, but there's no information flow back to the cartographer. So such a one-way information flow, that is something that is a typical indicator for context boundaries. But there are more indicators in this story.
Yes, there are. When we look at the story again, we can see that the word ship appears a few times. And when we remember the domain, we can see there are different kinds of ships. In different contexts, we use different ships. So we have this sounding ship down here, and we have the container ship, and we have the ship silhouette. All of them are ships, or models for ship, a model for a ship, and all of them are called ship in their context, but different things are meant with this. So what is nice about domain storytelling is that it shows us graphically when we are making mistakes. So if we would make the mistake and say, okay, all these ships are the same, we always hear the word ship, then we would probably have something like this. So we would have one ship and a lot of arrows pointing to it. And our domain expert would say, no, that's wrong. That's different kinds of ships. So that's good that we can use DST for that.
Okay, so here we have our second indicator. Often we see differences in languages. They are made visible with domain stories. And that's another good indicator for having two distinct, separate bounded contexts. Can you give us another indicator?
Yeah, one more indicator I've brought you. And for that, we have to look into the upper left corner. There's this annotation that tells us that the steps 1 to 5 are done on a daily basis. So this part down here, the sounding and the creation of the depth map, that is done every day. So that's triggered by time. And the maneuver simulation up there, that is not triggered by time. That's triggered, sorry, that is triggered on demand every time a captain asks the navigating officer for a new route. So this is, again, one bounded context. These are these steps 1 to 5 where we have this timely aspect.
Okay, and now we have 3 different indicators. So we have the one-way information flow, the differences in language, and even different triggers for parts of the story. Now with 3 indicators, we are fairly confident that we indeed found a valid boundary between 2 distinct bounded contexts. But as you probably know, indicators are no definitive proof that there's actually a context boundary there. So what I want to do now is to give you a counterexample. I will show you another indicator which did not lead to separate bounded context, where we decided, okay, no, this, even though there's an indicator there, we want to leave it inside the same context. Okay? So if you look at the cartographer and the sounding ship, we see a pattern that Henning described before. It's this one-way information flow. So we have this depth data, the raw data, that is sent from the sounding ship to the cartographer. So one could assume, maybe, you know, cartography and sounding, those are 2 separate things. Now, this one domain story doesn't tell us enough to make the decision if there's actually a context boundary here or not. But if we were to look deeper into this part of the domain, we would actually find out that the cartographer and the sounding ship, they work together quite closely. They're not just there for measuring depth data, they're actually managing the depth of the river because it needs to be adapted from time to time. So if we were to introduce 2 different bounded contexts here, that would really jeopardize how the cartographer and the sounding ship could work together. So that's not what we want to do. So we decided that this should stay in the same bounded context, even though we found this indicator. Okay. So it's already time to wrap it up. We hope that we could encourage you to try domain storytelling for yourself. Use it to learn about your domain. Use it to think about context boundaries.
Sorry.
It's okay. Experiment with it and
experiment with it.
Yeah, and most important, tell us about it. So tell us your stories. And that's it for today. And as we said earlier, we're happy to help you with your modeling problems in the Modeling for Strangers session, or come to our hands-on session tomorrow. We can fit 40 people into our workshop. And now we are taking questions. Thank you.
Thank you. At least if there are questions, yeah.
How many times have you read this domain express?
Hello.
The question is, how many times did you revisit the domain expert? Did you just visit them one time and then everything was discovered, or did you?
No. So this is just
unfortunately not.
Yeah, this is just the start of a process. So typically we would do, like, I don't know, 3 to 5 domain stories with this group of experts, so like on a big picture level. So we have a good idea what the most important cases are. So maybe there's container ship and a cruise ship. Maybe there are some things different. Maybe they are the same. Then we can do them in the same story. That's fine. We have to take care of all the important cases. And then there are different ways where to go from there. For example, we can do domain storytelling on a more detailed level within one bounded context, maybe with not just one cartographer, but with several cartographers. So we have different expertise, some differences in how people handle, for example, the depth data. So there's a lot more things that come afterwards. And of course, when we develop software, we want to develop software with an agile approach. So these are not like specifications or something. It's just a way to get started in a completely new domain, or to rediscover things in a domain that you found is familiar. But the funny thing is that if you bring together people that have been working side by side for years, they can still discover new things that they didn't know about each other and about their work.
And that's also typical. I go back to the story, that you find persons when your story is told to you that are not in the meeting now and you want to know about. So, for example, the captain here may be somebody you want to talk to as well, and to let him tell you your story.
Or the people on the sounding ship. Can you pass the mic up there? Whoa, yeah, great.
Thank you. Have you ever mixed domain storytelling with other approach like event storming or something else? And what worked and what didn't work?
Yeah. Sorry. I'm
okay.
Not. Okay. I just turn off my clicker now. Yes, I have, or we have, and the approaches. Event storming and domain storytelling, they developed independently from each other, and there are a lot of cases where you can use both of them or one of them, and there are edge cases where one or the other is better suited. For example, domain storytelling is especially well suited when you have cooperative work. That means where people work together. So you can visualize that very good. And you can use DST for different things that don't have to do anything with domain-driven design. For example, finding shadow IT is also a use case for it. And mixing approaches, what my experience is that it's good to have more than one tool you can use. And when you use one tool, for example, you start with event storming, and then you recognize for whatever reason it doesn't work out. The domain experts, they do not come to the point. Then let's try just another tool, and then event storming. Then domain storytelling is another tool, and the other way around. So often it's a good thing to just do something new, because then you change the viewpoint and you have another possibility to catch to. And what's important is all of these approaches are only tools, nothing more. They're not the real goal. The goal lies behind that. We want to help our users do their job better or more easy or more efficient.
So the cool thing is that ever since we started to talk about domain storytelling, and people start to adopt it and use it, they come up with different ideas, what to do with it and how to combine it, for example, with event storming. So this is really a great learning experience for us to get the feedback, and people say, hey, I did first an event storming, and then I saw there's this one sequence of events where a lot of people have to work together, and then I did a domain story for that. So that's pretty cool for us someone who spread the idea and then suddenly there's feedback coming back from a community.
Okay. There is another question.
Okay. Can you go back, please, to the example with the map?
Yeah.
Yeah, so here, in this case, if the cartographer needed information from the navigation officer, what would you do in this case? Because this would violate the first indicator, which is one-way information flow. Would the navigation officer sit with 1 foot in one bounded context and 1 foot in the other one? Or how do you handle these cases?
I wouldn't say there's any violation there. So if that's how they work, then our model was wrong and we didn't have that piece of information, so we have to adapt our model and our perception of how they actually work together. So yeah, maybe it would lead to the discovery that no, a context boundary doesn't make sense here. We have to get rid of it and everything is in one bounded context. Maybe we will discover something else. So I don't think that in this case there was actually like information flow back. So
no, I mean, if I don't know, maybe they need to ask the navigation officer if the weather is good or whatever. This would mean arrow going to the officer and back. So this means you don't have the first indicator, and then what do? You put the navigation officer in this bounded context?
Not necessarily, no. So the other indicators may still be valid. So so maybe it's still a good idea to have this separate bounded context there. It doesn't mean that you have to have all 3 indicators. There are, of course, more indicators. There are just like 3 common ones that we see over and over again. It doesn't mean that you have to have exactly these 3, and if there's 3, then it's separate bounded context, and if it's only 2, then it's not. So I guess the answer is it depends.
Cool. I love this answer.
Yeah.
Yeah. We are sorry, but we are consultants. Okay.
Oh, can you make that?
I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry, man.
Not bad, not bad.
Eigenlijk moet hij even wachten voordat hij het na een grote klap, dan duurt het even.
Testing?
Yeah.
Cool. All right, so when you do an event storming session, you tell the participants a few of the rules. What would you say the rules are for domain storytelling?
Yeah, it's a good one. Well, there are rules, and if you do it in a strict sense, they are kind of embodied in the moderator. So if we do it the first time with a group of people, well, the moderator kind of holds all the threads together. If it's an experienced group, then, well, we just kind of facilitators, but not moderators, then they can do it on their own. So one rule is that if the session is over, we all have to agree on the story. So if there are any differences in perceptions, we take notes, make annotations, try to resolve them later. Maybe say, okay, there's an important distinction between if it's a container ship and a cruise ship. Then we write it down and say, okay, let's talk about this later, but you know, we want to get to the end of the story. It doesn't make sense to, but that's actually the reason why there are no cases, no ifs. In my experience, if occasionally you have to use something like BPNN or UML activity diagrams, and people get so stuck in this, well, this could happen, this could happen, this could happen, this could happen. And then you talk for an hour about everything that could happen, but you haven't really told one actual case of, okay, this happens. So the most important rule is tell a coherent story from beginning to end so that everyone in the room says, okay, I can live with that. Maybe there's some details not there, that's fine. We cannot make a perfect model of everything, but okay, there shouldn't be anyone that says, okay, no, this doesn't work for me. I'm also a navigating officer, and I don't find myself in there. That's not how I work. So that's probably the most important rule, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. And another rule is, of course, it's not about the story we can see. It's about that the story is the same in the heads of the people that are in the workshop. I think here was the next question.
Is there any specific approach for countering the cases, like strategy, how you deal with them?
Well, there are 2 things that come to my mind. The first one is that usually when I model, I reserve some space for cases, variations, assumptions, all that kind of stuff. And when we're done, we go through the list and say, okay, is that a small variation? Then maybe annotation is fine. Like, okay, we'll do this with a container ship, but it's the same for cruise ships, just step, I don't know, there's a little difference in step 9 maybe, okay? And if it's a big difference, then we will do another domain story for that. That's one way, and one thing that we didn't show you is, of course, before you start with something like that, you have to have this idea that, okay, there is something like maneuver planning, so there's this task. So what we do usually first is we collect different use cases. That's the first step. And then we let the people decide, okay, which are the ones that are most relevant to us for the problem that we have to solve. So that's another way of dealing with cases. Yeah. So there was one up there, yes.
Hi, so this is a big picture model that you made. So if you afterwards zoom in, do you then still use this technique? Or do you make it more abstract then?
Not really more abstract.
No, you can use this technique, domain storytelling, also for small picture things and to go more deeply into it. So these work items we see here are, of course, all candidates for becoming aggregates. And all these actions we have are candidates to turn into methods if you're object-oriented, or into commands if you think about that. So you can go very deeply into the details, and then really see a domain model that's emerging from a domain story.
Yeah. So if we dive deeper into the context and maybe do another domain story with, let's say, a couple of cartographers, then we will reach a level where we can actually kind of see the entities, aggregates, commands and stuff in the model, and then it's really easy for us to have, like, okay, an idea. I've a good idea how I would implement that. Yeah. So that's the level of detail we go to sometimes, if it's appropriate.
For example, when we look at the ship silhouette, and in the step 8, we can see, okay, ship silhouette is a candidate for turning into an aggregate, which may then have methods move and turn. So there we are, pretty much detailed.
So I think there was one here. Yeah.
What happens if the river Elbe is not deep enough for the ship?
Oh, well.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. Then you go to Rotterdam.
What we didn't tell you is it's more complicated than scenario we showed to you. There's at least one more context we need here, and I told you that Hamburg is not really a seaport; it's a river port. But to be honest, it is a seaport lying on a river. So we have this shallow and narrow port, but we have high tide and low tide. So although it's a river, the river is not flowing downstream all the day. But when we high tide, the Northern Sea comes back into the port. So then we have more water under the keel. So that for the ships with great depth, we also look that they come into the port when we have flood. Yeah. So that's another part of this maneuver simulation, that we have a prediction of the tidal flow for the next 24 hours. And the short answer is, it costs a lot of money.
Yeah, that's true. They do a lot to make it possible, like tearing down bridges or making the riverbed deeper, stuff like that. Yeah.
Okay, maybe one last question. Would you apply domain-driven storytelling for cases where you don't know where the bottleneck is? Because sometimes, in most cases where I worked for, it's not very clear what the bottleneck is, and it's a whole process to explore with the domain experts what the real bottleneck is. So I don't know for storytelling if that's a good
that sounds to me like this is a good case to try a big picture domain storytelling, to get a big picture what's happening in my domain, and then maybe from there dig deeper and see where are my bottlenecks. Because probably there where the bottleneck is, you will probably want to dig deeper and go more detailed.
Storytelling is something that humans do very well. It comes to us naturally. And what I experience over and over again is that, after a couple of minutes, people start to open up and tell you the things that they always found bad, that never worked, stuff like that. That's again when the moderator comes into play. So that would be another rule, like you have to keep balance of the whole process, so no one takes up all the time or makes it like a personal therapy session. But these pain points, they usually can be made visible rather quickly. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.